Heart of Oak Naval Miniature Rules for the Age of Fighting Sail. In 1807, the forces of Great Britain and France were at a crossroads. Locked in, oh my god, can you imagine trying to listen to a whole video like that? I am not about to do the low-rent documentary series with a sing-song voice. Come on! So annoying. I'm going to do a naval campaign, and rather than go through the history like some kind of goofball from public radio, let me just tell you the story. It's a really good story, and it's going to be a really good campaign. Before we talk about how we're going to manage this campaign, spoilers, it's going to be kind of an ad hoc basis. Let's talk a little bit about the historical campaign. It's a fascinating story. Biscotti's here to help us do that. The year is 1807. The oceans are battlefields. You all get that reference. Biscotti does. She's seen that movie so many times. It's a wonder she doesn't talk about the lesser of two evils. The British, 1807, have a problem. Same problem they've had for the entire era. They have not enough ships for everything that needs to be done. And Mauritius is a huge thorn in the side. It's on the opposite side of the world, but it is a fulcrum on which the conflict hinges. Let's talk about why. This is the Western Indian Ocean, and way up here are the British colonies. This is the Bay of Bengal. It's a crossroads between east and west, and the British control it. But the French have raiders in the area, privateers prowling about, snapping up any ships that are left undefended. And that's hard to defend all those ships because any wealth transferring both from east to west and from west to east, a lot of people forget that this was a two-direction situation, has to go through this area. And as you can see, when it comes to the Western Indian Ocean, there's a whole lot of nothing. The nearest British naval base is way down here in this corner. That is Cape Town, 7,000 miles away, give or take. Right smack in the dab of that nothing is a little speck called, well, on this map, it's called Port Louis. That is the location of Mauritius, named by the Dutch traders when they discovered it, now in 1807, 1808, under the control of the French, who call the main island, the largest island, the Ile-de-France. There's another twin island. These are only about 10 to 20 miles across. There's another twin island. We'll show you the map here in just a second. And then just kind of a little spittle, a little tiny little thing, about 2 miles by 4 miles across, 400 miles off to the east. These are all going to be really important. Just trust me on this. The problem that the British have is that their whole naval strategy for containing the French, who outnumber them, remember, is to keep them bottled up in their ports. But the French privateers are able to get in and out of Mauritius because there are 4 ports, 2 on either side of each of these 2 islands. And these islands are tall. Great big honking mountains in the center of them. This is the westernmost island. Today we call it Reunion. And the eastern island we call Mauritius. Looks maybe a little something like this. There's watchtowers on the top of those islands. And as the French come sailing back with their fat prizes in tow, they get to pick which port they go to. And the guys in the watchtowers can tell them via semaphore. Remember, on top of a mountain, you can see 100 miles. The little British ships trying to blockade the ports, they can only see about 5 miles. So you can communicate well before the British ships catch sight of the French ships. They can say, hey, don't come here, go next door. Makes it a lot easier to run those blockades. 1808 is a particularly good year for raiding for the French. And the British say, look, we have to fix this situation. They break loose. Cape Town says, look, I got 4 ships. One of them's a little older. I got a couple of smaller little raiding vessels, kind of privateers in their own right, little sloops, little brigs. We're going to send those up. It's going to tilt the balance of power. They have to wait for hurricane season to end. Remember, Cape Town is a lot further south than you think, and it's right between the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic Ocean. Not an easy place to sail. So you got to wait for things to calm down a little bit. They sail on up to Mauritius thinking this would be great. Now we got the tiebreaker, only to find that the French had stolen a march on them. If you can use that turn of phrase for a naval campaign. Well, we're using it today. The Hamelin expedition was waiting for them in port. Actually, that's not true. They weren't waiting. One of the ships, a couple of ships had already sailed up to the Bay of Bengal. They'd already been raiding. By the time the year ended, 13 British ships, including a couple of fat East India Trading Company vessels loaded with loot, had already been up and back down, their hulls filled. The problem was part of the problem, I should say, is once they got into port, they had some friends called the Americans, and the Americans were ostensibly neutral, but they were making money off both sides, and they didn't want to enter into a shooting match with either of these two empires. The British couldn't afford to open a new front, at least for a few years. Remember 1808? 4 years later, the British would be more than willing to do that, and it wouldn't go so well for the Yanks. But we're not talking about that today, and not just because it's a little embarrassing. What we are talking about is that at the time that the Mauritius Campaign is ongoing, the French could transfer their loot onto American ships, and they could sail out la-di-da, easy as you please, and there's nothing the British could do without sparking a wider conflict. This really annoyed them. So they sent these ships up, but they weren't completely out of options at this point. Because remember that little island 400 miles to the east? That's called Rodriguez. That's what it's called today, and that's how I pronounce it as an Anglo. It's only about 2 miles across by 4 miles across. Not a really solid port facility, but you could park a bunch of heavy cannons there. You could anchor. You could bring on fresh water. You could bring on a little bit of fresh vegetables, drop off your sick and wounded, bring on some fresh wood. You didn't have to go the full 3,000 miles back to Cape Town. The British managed to seize that by dispatching about 500 soldiers from the Indian subcontinent. They come down, kick the locals out, by locals I mean French, and make it a little toehold that gives them a little refueling station. You might call it a coaling station later on in future conflicts. But for now, it's all the British need to put their plans in action. The guy in charge is this fella. His name is Rowley. Admiral Rowley. And unfortunately, my kids have watched Diary of a Wimpy Kid too often, so in my brain, I'm having a real hard time because this is what I picture when it comes to Admiral Rowley. But he's no slouch. And he's 3,000 miles away and several months sailing there and back from his bosses in Cape Town. So he's got freedom of movement. He's got ambition, and he doesn't have to run all of his plans past his superiors. He could just say, hey, I got 500 guys here. We took Rodriguez almost without firing a shot. Why am I not dropping them off on these other two islands, Ile-de-France, Napoleon, today Mauritius, and I can't remember Reunion is what the other one is called, or because it's French, Réunion, but I'm not French, so I probably would just keep calling it Reunion. And the point is that the ports are really well defended. You can't get a ship in there because the big cannons, one of them in particular, has 124 cannons. And for those of you that haven't done naval wargaming before, you have to understand these cannons are big. They're a lot bigger than anything you put on a boat. With a boat, you got to worry about things like how heavy is the gun? How many cannonballs can I stick? How much gunpowder? The island's not going to sink. So you can use bigger guns with bigger range, and you can pull a dirty little trick. You take your cannonballs and you stick them in the fire. You heat them up red hot. You load them using tongs. Now, you can't do this on a boat because you don't want a whole bunch of open fires on a boat. Boats, at the time, were made of wood. Worse, they were waterproofed with pitch and oil. And they got these big white flappy things made out of canvas. And so if you took a hit in the wrong place with these red hot cannonballs, you caught fire. Not good when you're carrying, 50-pound casks of gunpowder around all the time. Shore-based batteries, very dangerous. For boats, not for raiders. The good news for the British is that these islands have a lot of little coves and little beaches that are great for landing. And if you can get some guys onto those islands when the French aren't looking, you can attack those big gun batteries from the shore side. And this is exactly what Hamelin does. Not Hamelin, excuse me. Hamelin is the French commander. And Hamelin is doing the best he can. He's raking in money hand over fist. All props to the French. Their defense was really solid, with one notable exception we're going to talk about here in just a moment. The British, realizing they can't sail straight into the harbors, adopt a strategy of harrying and harassment and raiding via the beaches. And their first one is a big one. They make a little feint towards the Ile-de-France and then sail the Reunion and launch a raid on the harbor of St. Paul. They take the batteries and they turn them on the French boats. But not until a couple of British vessels sail into the harbor. And the French are probably sitting there like, zut alors, the batteries will take care of them, not realizing the batteries had already been taken. Instead of firing on the British vessels, the batteries start firing on the French vessels, and they do the only thing they can. They sail their boats on land so that when they get blasted to smithereens, they don't sink in 50 feet of water. Very smart, very clever. We can come back. So they pull back from the port and basically let the British have the run of the place. They know that there's a town on the other side of the island. We're going to get reinforcements. We'll push these guys out. It's going to be hard for them to retreat. Not going to be a problem. The British know this too. They're just doing a raid, so they start knocking down the defenses that they can, burning what they can't load up on their vessels. They burn a warehouse with 500,000 British pounds worth of expensive silks. Would have been the spoils of war, would have been shared out among everybody participating in the raid. The admiral would have made millions, but they torched it because they were expecting a counterattack that never came. The commander of the island of Reunion, those defenses, was so embarrassed by this successful raid, he was unable to act. By the time he finally gets his act together, the British have loaded back onto their vessels, sailed away. This convinced the British that, man, if we just had a few thousand more soldiers, we could have probably taken the whole island. Now we've got half the place, and they've got a perfect jumping off point. So that's what they do. I'm going to cut to the chase. They take Reunion Island much the same manner, turn their attention to the island next door, and this time their plan is to attack Port Royal. Now, Port Royal is a little tougher nut to crack because the harbor mouth is guarded by this little island right here. So the British land, take the island, not a problem. Then they have to worry about the shore-based batteries, and they have to worry about getting into the port. Fortunately, they have one of the pilots who has essentially defected. To get into Port Royal, you have to sail through this twisting path through the coral reefs. And this guy says, yeah, boss, no problem. I can guide you through. So they put him on a boat, and he is ready to, they're on a night raid. They're fully committed. They got 3 of their vessels, and they run aground. Because what the pilot didn't tell them is he didn't have a whole lot of experience sailing at night. He also used the buoys and markers in the channel to navigate. Well, the French pulled those out as soon as they realized what was happening. So the guy bluffed his way through. It didn't work. So now you got a boat that's being fired at from the shore batteries. You got to send another boat in to rescue them. That boat runs aground. Oh boy. Now you're fully invested. You got to send a third boat in. And so these are some of the shots. Like, this is one of the most tragic events of the war. Huge reversal for the British. They wind up losing both vessels. The other vessel, the only way they managed to make it out of the harbor is by doing this thing where they raise the anchor and they put it in one of the little boats and they sail over and they drop it. And then they winch the boat slowly to where the anchor is. And then they pull the anchor up, they put it in a boat, and then they drop it. And then they winch it up until it's up on the boat. And so they're just like 100 yards at a time. They're taking cannon shots the whole time. The vessel is completely blasted, almost useless. It's going to take a long time to repair. And that is pretty much the end of things. They lose all kinds of men. However, while this is going on, they have landed troops elsewhere on the island, and they're just tearing up the joint. So it's a disaster for the British. And now the commanders back in Cape Town realize we're done with half measures. They gather up a huge flotilla. And what they don't realize at the time is that the victory at Port Royal, all these burned British vessels, is a Pyrrhic victory. Because the British have done enough damage through a war of attrition, and all those prisoners are eating everything that's not nailed down. I mean, the French are not bad guys here, right? They put up a spirited defense, but they only have so many resources. And now that the British only have to bottle up 2 ports instead of 4, it's a much easier job. It's going to take a big fleet in order to relieve the defenders of Ile-de-France. That fleet is coming, but they don't know it. Remember, they don't have any communications. Those are cut off by the blockading force. The British don't know it's coming either. They bring their flotilla up, and it's pretty much a done deal. The overwhelming force, they land. The French put up one of those nice honorable defenses and then say, time out, we're just going to get our boats and sail away. Save what they can. Like 3-4 weeks later, a huge relief force arrives from France. Might have tipped the balance. What would have happened if it had arrived a month earlier? If it had beaten the British fleet to the punch, might have gone a whole different way. And that is a very interesting question, and one that we may wind up exploring as we play out our own Mauritius campaign on the table. How are we going to do that? Well, with a mix of ways. The nice thing is that we have some land-based raids that we can do. We have some naval operations. We have some blockade running getting out. We have some ships coming in. And we can put together a little, I wouldn't really call it a narrative campaign, because we know what vessels were there. And we're going to move them around. But the events of one scenario are absolutely going to be reflected in future scenarios. And with a couple of French privateers arriving a little too late, or if the British defenders get a little lucky and they can intercept one or two, that's just a couple of less resources that the French have. If the defenders on the land-based side, if the lookouts, the pickets, are paying a little bit more attention and they see the raiders coming, instead of waltzing in by land easy as you please, the British raiding force could be wiped out. And that might mean that you either have to wait another year to get reinforcements, or that you have to try raiding somewhere else, and it's got to be a smaller raid, or there's all kinds of things that could go wrong for our campaign. Just as a brief example, when the British did take this little island that blocked the channel to get into Port Royal, one of the reasons they thought it was such a great coup is that, according to the strictures of the day, you could run the French flag up so long as you didn't open fire. So the British, sitting in their fortress, saw one of the French frigates approaching. And they said, hey, run the French flag up. Don't let them know it's us. And then when they get in just the right position to open fire on them, we'll lower the French flag, raise the British flag, and just hit them with every gun. The problem was one of those flukes of history. As the French flag came down, it's a windy day, right? It's high winds means the blockade runner can move really fast. The high winds flap the flag, brushes one of the nearby fires they're using to heat the cannon shot, brushes back, sets off gunpowder cask here. The whole thing goes up like a Roman candle. Kablooey. The defenders are so startled, the French just sail in. Instead of being down a ship, one of those flukes. The only way this ship won't make it into port is if I roll snake eyes. And you know what happens when I say the only thing that could go wrong is me rolling snake eyes. I'm going to roll snake eyes. If that hadn't happened, that French vessel goes to the bottom of the ocean. That means maybe the buoys are still in place when the raid happens a couple of days later. And instead of losing the whole fleet, things go swimmingly for the British because they don't wind up with half their force going swimmingly in the drink. These are the kind of flukes that happen on our table, just as they happen in the real world. And in our next episode, we're going to lay out exactly which ground forces are where. I've got this map of the islands that I'm going to use, and we're going to start off with just some easy little logistic issues with which boats are where to start, when do they start coming onto the board, setting some of that at random just to keep things interesting, and then maybe even doing a little bit of blockade running. Got to get those treasure ships into the port. Maybe you save your frigate, but instead of sailing in with 3 East Indiaman vessels, you only come in with 2. And that means you have fewer supplies on the blockaded island, which shortens the conflict. I don't know. The world is our oyster, and the Mauritius campaign is the pearl. And we're going to dig that son of a gun out and have a good time over the coming weeks and months. I hope you come along with me. Till then, thanks for keeping us company, Biscotti. I'm praying for you.